There are too many legendary Pokemon. Gone are the days where every legendary was memorable and exciting. Instead, they release over a dozen every generation, and many of them have bland, uninspired design choices. Their mere existence ruins both the post game experience of playing a Pokemon game as well as the competitive experience in VGC. In this video, I am going to explain these bold claims from both a casual and competitive point of view. This is obviously just my opinion, but I'd love it if you heard me out, and then let me know if you agree in the comments because this is probably going to spark some debate. So, this chart has every single legendary Pokemon, and which generation it was introduced in. And as you can see, the first couple generations did not have all that many legendaries. Generation 4 was the first time this legend deflation has occurred, with 14 legendaries being introduced. And this really is the start of the problem. I think the formula of a legendary trio, cover legendaries for each game, and a mythical Pokemon is pretty strong overall. Although I do think that Mesprit, Uxie, and Azelf are the single most forgettable legendary trio. I mean, they all kind of look the same, and their creationist mythos of imbuing humans with willpower and emotions doesn't really resonate with me as much as these monsters that control time and space, or golems of rock, ice, and steel, you know? But that's not really the point, but that's a little tangent. Overall, I think the legendary in Generation 4 are actually quite memorable. The Cresselia and Darkrai plots were one of the highlights of Diamond and Pearl. The Shaman and Arceus encounters and the Distortion World are all really memorable as well. And Manaphy having underachieving kids is relatable for all the parents out there who have to watch their children grow up to be competitive Pokemon players. So, while I think that 7 or 8 legendaries in a generation is pretty ideal, if you're going to lovingly craft a backstory and a quest to obtain every single one of them, I really can't complain about 14 legendaries in a generation. Except for Heatran. I will complain about that guy. He was just sitting there. I mean, if it wasn't exceptionally good in competitive play, I probably would have forgotten that Heatran exists, but I digress. In Generation 6, I think that Game Freak realized the problem that they had created, which is to say that they realized there are too many legendary Pokemon. If you want to keep the collect 'em all mantra going, you have to make these old legendary Pokemon obtainable. So, instead of creating a brand new legendary trio, they just made it so you can capture the Kanto birds and Mewtwo in Pokemon X and Y. And I should also note that this is when VGC made it, so you have to have captured a Pokemon in the current generation in order to use it in competitive play, which they scrapped a couple generations later. But at this point, if they wanted to see these legendaries get used in competitive, they had to re-release them in the latest games. Oh, and also, at some point, they decided that every legendary Pokemon needed an item to change forms, and so they had to shove a half dozen items into the game as well. So, let's talk about Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, which are the much-awaited remakes of Ruby and Sapphire, which, Sapphire being the first game that I ever owned, was something that I was very excited for. They introduced the Delta episode in the post-game, which I have mixed feelings about, but honestly, that's a different debate altogether, and I've already gone off on 2 tangents. I don't need to go on any more. I will go on more, but I don't need to. Really, there was only one thing only one thing. I mean, only one thing that people wanted to see in these remakes, and I really mean universally, exactly one thing that everyone wanted to see in these remakes, and that is the Battle Frontier. And we did not get that. Instead, the postgame was centered around catching 30 different legendary Pokemon. That's it. Look up a guide, fly to the right spot, and catch another legendary Pokemon. Rinse and repeat. Over and over and over again. And this is when legendary Pokemon stopped feeling legendary. This was Generation 6, and it's only gotten worse since then. I really thought that Pokemon had learned their lesson in Generation 6 when they made a conscious decision to drastically cut down the number of new legendary Pokemon. Instead, in Generation 7, they just doubled down. They introduced 20 legendary Pokemon in this game. And yes, I know the fandom has a debate about whether Silvally is considered a legendary and whether Ultra Beast and Paradox Pokemon are considered legendary Pokemon, but I'm looking at this as a primarily competitive player. And in Scarlet and Violet, we had Regulation A and H, where they banned all legendary Pokemon, and this included all of the Paradox Pokemon, and I think the Ultra Beasts fall into the same camp. I'm not really interested in having a debate about nomenclature and categorization. I think that their stats are basically legendary, and really, the point I'm trying to make is irrespective of the semantics of this. But anyways, let me start with the good. These Tapus are excellent design. They are present throughout the storyline, and they are treated with reverence by basically every character that talks about them. They feel like legendary Pokemon when you are playing the game. They also pay homage to the native Hawaiian culture, which the region is based off of, and I am a huge nerd for. Finally, they added a new dimension to the game competitively. Terrains were introduced into the game in Generation 6, but they were basically never used. Adding automatic terrain setters to the game forced us to explore a brand new field effect, and it is a very healthy mechanic. To control what terrain is on the field, you need to position your Pokemon perfectly. You have to switch in your terrain setter at the right time to really take advantage of its effects and nullify your opponent's effects. These are new legendary Pokemon that have great lore and interesting abilities that change the way that you play Pokemon in a positive way, and I love it. I'm a huge fan. The same cannot be said of the Ultra Beasts, who all have the same ability. Beast Boost boosts your highest stat when your Pokemon takes a knockout, and this is a very strong ability. It's also boring. It makes it so when you start winning the game, it becomes even easier to win the game than normal. And this, in my opinion, is not healthy for competitive Pokemon. You already have an advantage when you take a knockout. Your opponent has fewer options for defensive switches, they have less firepower. I mean, I don't need to explain why taking a knockout is good in Pokemon. And they made it even better. You want players to be able to come back into a game that they're losing by making solid plays and gaining incremental progress, and Pokemon like the Ultra Beasts make that even harder to do. So surely they won't double down on this mechanic, right? Right? Fuck. Alright, don't worry. The Calyrex rant is coming soon. But that's not the only problem I have with the Ultra Beasts, but it is the root problem. You see, by giving them all the same ability, most of them play in a very similar way. They want to be offensive Pokemon that move first and hit hard, because their ability dictates that's the optimal way to use these Pokemon. Their stat distributions are also min-maxed like crazy. I mean, do you want a frail special attacker that boosts its stat every time it takes a knockout? Well, here's 4 of them. These are all the same Pokemon with different typings. And don't get me started on Kartana, which has a higher attack stat than Mega Rayquaza. If you want to know why Incineroar and Landorus had a combined 100% usage in VGC 2018, well, this is the number one reason. The only way this Pokemon would ever be bad is if 109 base speed became a slow speed stat, which it did almost immediately. The one big exception to all of these criticisms, I think, is Celesteela, which has a well-rounded base stat total and a very different playstyle, and also actually saw competitive play as compared to the other exceptions to this rule, like Guzzlord, that just didn't. They were bad, right? And overall, I think Celesteela is a fairly well-designed and welcome addition to VGC, except for one thing, which is that it makes a Pokemon like Corviknight entirely unusable when it's in the game. And I will loop back to that thought, so keep it in the back of your mind while you're watching. The sad part is, this could have all been avoided. The main storyline in Sun and Moon only really involves Nihilego, and Nihilego is a good Pokemon competitively. It is also by far the most memorable Ultra Beast because of its battle cutscene thing with Lusamine. We did not need more Ultra Beasts for the story to make sense. Think back to what makes the Tapus so good. The characters treat them with reverence, they have an important role in the story, and they have unique abilities. Nihilego could have checked all of those boxes. And then the postgame happens, and it's just another box filler legendary. I mean, go and catch another 8 more of these guys. Why not? you could introduce maybe one more Ultra Beast in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, and we'd have been set. We have enough legendary Pokemon to fill a post-game story already, and instead of having to shoehorn 10 new legendary Pokemon into the post-game of every game from now on top of the Tapus and Necrozma and whatnot, you'd only have 2. And I think we'd be better off for it. Their playstyle would be unique, their abilities would be interesting, and they'd all have a point of being in the story. Now, I have a lot to say about Generation 8, but most of it is about how the story doesn't make sense. Like, why is Calyrex the good guy in the Crown Tundra DLC? He takes control of your friend's mind, who, by the way, you just met his daughter, and you know that her uncle is in jail, so she doesn't have anywhere else to go if Calyrex controls this dude. So Calyrex is literally blackmailing you to help it take control of a horse that is just living its best life. And then it becomes the de facto ruler of a village that seems to be doing quite well, even without its help. I mean, Calyrex is egregiously the bad guy, right? Like, even if its actions don't tell you that, surely the fact that it's riding an undead horse should tell you that. Like, it looks like the Night King from Game of Thrones. Come on. It couldn't be more obvious. And yet, it's framed as the good guy in this story. It makes no sense. Anyways, here's how you fix Generation 8. You make Calyrex do all of this as the bad guy in the main storyline. And it turns out that Calyrex Ice's best counter is actually Zamazenta, because it gets a defense boost and is a steel type and has wide guard for Glacial Lance, so it's really good against it. And you also make Calyrex Shadow just a little bit slower. It's fast enough already. And if you do that, Zacian outspeeds it and would become its perfect counter as well, which would make a really good endgame boss battle for where you had to use your legendary Pokemon. It would have interacted with the characters, it's clearly evil, and it's very powerful. The realization that you helped this evil creature is a pretty good storyline too. I mean, the existing storyline of a seemingly benevolent billionaire that seems to care about renewable energy, but then it turns out to be incredibly evil. It's a little overdone, don't you think? And not to mention, Eternatus is basically not mentioned in the entire story until you fight it. It's like the single most forgettable villain. Anyways, you know how they had to shoehorn 47 old legendary Pokemon into the Crown Tundra DLC, so they threw them all in an optional minigame called the Dynamax Adventures? Well, what if, at the end of those 47 encounters, you feel a disturbance in the Force? You get called in to do one last Dynamax adventure, and boom! There's Eternatus. And once you beat it, it transforms into its Eternamax form and blows you out of the lair. And you have to call upon your most powerful allies to defeat the final Dynamax lair. How cool would that have been? Instead of one of the most forgettable legendary Pokemon, it would be one of the most difficult to obtain legendary Pokemon, and you would have to earn your battle with it. And that would be the perfect culmination to the DLC, not to mention a callback to one of the best moments in gaming that I think everyone my age experienced, where you had to get surprised by the giant hand in Smash Bros. Melee. I mean, it would be really good. And also, I think that is the only thing that would have gotten me to do 47 Dynamax Adventures, which is crazy because they have legendary Pokemon in them, and I'm supposed to be excited about catching legendary Pokemon. But you know what legendary I was excited about obtaining? Urshifu. And those who watch my channel regularly know that I hate Urshifu. It breaks the rules of competitive Pokemon in a way that is just unfun. But I also really, really liked the Isle of Armor DLC. The entire DLC focuses on Kubfu and Urshifu. You have to use the Kubfu to progress through the storyline, you gain a connection with this Pokemon, you learn its backstory, and it forces you to explore the region entirely. And if it hadn't proceeded to commit war crimes for the next 5 years, I'd probably still like it. This is what happens when you don't need to put 47 Pokemon into a postgame. You get to really focus on one story and tell us what this Pokemon is all about. It reminds me of the Cresselia side quest I loved as a kid, except with even more depth to it. And the same goes for the Teal Mask DLC in Generation 9, where you meet Ogrepon. You don't just go to a wormhole to fight these guys. You actually learn their story and you bond with them. And ogrepon is like one of the best designed legendary Pokemon ever. Because of its backstory, it's beloved in the community, but also all 4 of its forms do something unique and powerful in competitive play, and so all 4 forms see some use. It's also the first follow me grass type we've ever had, which makes Amoonguss and Spore way less powerful in VGC without a direct nerf to those Pokemon, which is also really, really good for the game. Even the Pecharunt mini DLC in, I think I pronounced that right, Pecharunt? Even the Pecharunt mini DLC in Teal Mask is also a really fun little quest. It's better than just encountering these legendary Pokemon one at a time or being given them via mystery gift, which makes it a stark contrast to every single Paradox Pokemon, which are just walking around in the overworld like they're normal-ass Pokemon and not some of the most boring but overpowered Pokemon in existence. Let's go back and talk about the things that I like and dislike in legendary Pokemon. I said they should be mentioned in the mythology of the region. The characters should treat them with reverence. They should play an important role in the story. They should have a unique combination of moves and abilities. They should have distinct designs. In other words, put all of that together and they should feel legendary. And you could argue that a couple of them do check these boxes, like at least Iron Treads and Great Tusk were in the overworld, so they do kind of do some of that. But most of them break all of these rules. In fact, your first interaction with a Paradox Pokemon in Area Zero is Penny not realizing that they're not just another normal Pokemon. They are literally just walking around like normal Pokemon alongside other actual normal Pokemon. Not to mention, they all have the same ability, which may as well read, give this Pokemon a speed boost the first time it switches onto the field, because that's all that Fluttermane, Iron Bundle, Iron Valiant, Iron Leaves, Iron Jugulis, Screamtail, Sandy Shocks, Roaring Moon, and Gouging Fire ever do with it. They all do the same thing. It messes with competitive Pokemon speed tiers so badly that Regieleki isn't fast enough anymore. And the ones that don't use booster energy to get a speed boost just don't use their ability at all. Like, they might as well not have one. Which brings me to what the real point of this video is. I really hate Iron Hands, man. First off, it is an ugly looking Pokemon. I mean, its design is so bland. There are some Paradox Pokemon that I think have pretty inspired designs, but I have not met a single person that thinks Iron Hands is interesting. It is as boring as possible. I mean, they really phoned it in with this one. It also is like the most easy to find Paradox Pokemon. It has no part in the story whatsoever. Its only lore is in a book that is found in the postgame that says it might be a cyborg Hariyama. Like, no shit! Brilliant deduction, Turo. Is that peer-reviewed or what? It also never uses its ability unless it's paired with exactly Miraidon, which you shouldn't want to do because they are both electric types, and they both also have a weakness to Fairy, so they have awful defensive synergy, and yet you do put them together because Iron Hands is literally the single best Pokemon ever made. And if it's not that one, it's Fluttermane. And if it's not one of those two, then it's Urshifu. But at least they tried to do something with Urshifu. Like, they knew they were breaking the rules with Urshifu, and they didn't care. And that makes it at least an inspired design choice, even if it may have gone a little too far. But Iron Hands and Fluttermane are filler legendary Pokemon. They don't look like legendary Pokemon. They don't feel like legendary Pokemon when you meet them. They're just there. But they have absolutely insane stat distributions. They are min-maxed to the extreme. And so every single time that you want a physical tank on your team, it has to be better than this monster of a Pokemon. And every time you want a special sweeper or you want a fast support Pokemon, it has to be better than Fluttermane. And it basically never is, which is why these two have been omnipresent in VGC for the last 2 years. And unless they are nerfed or taken out of the game entirely, they are never going away. It's one thing that Landorus Therian has been present in VGC for the last decade. I don't mind that because it has weaknesses. it doesn't have a good stab move to use and also has a 4x weakness. Even Earthquake, which is its best move, can be nullified by Rillaboom and Grassy Terrain. But Iron Hands and Fluttermane, they may as well not have a weakness. And if they do ever face a weakness, you can just Terrastalize. So guess what? No, they don't. Which means that if you ever would rather have a different typing for one of these Pokemon on your team, you can just turn your big ol' stat ball into whatever type it needs to be to give your team defensive synergy instead of using a different, unique, and interesting Pokemon. When I first played through Violet and I beat Geetha and unlocked Area 0, I remember seeing a wild Glimmora. And at the time, I didn't know that Glimmet evolves into Glimmora because who uses Glimmet in game? So I thought that Glimmora was only available in Area 0, and that implied that Geetha had come to Area 0 to catch her ace Pokemon. And honestly, I wish that was true. It would have been so much cooler if Area 0 was filled with powerful, fully evolved Pokemon that we basically never see in the wild. It would still be this strange, dangerous area that kids are not supposed to go into, but they wouldn't need to fill the game with 20 filler legendary Pokemon that feel anything but legendary. They feel normal, mundane, and yet their mere existence worsens competitive play and guarantees that the postgame of every single game from now on is going to be chock full of them. If they had only kept 6 Paradox Pokemon, just the revamped Johto and Unova trios, I think that would have been so much better. Because these 6 have relatively unique typings, and they all have signature moves. They're all special in at least one way. And by having fewer of them, you can focus on them and build their story, instead of giving each of them a single sentence in a post-game book. And because they're based on existing legendary Pokemon, they feel legendary. Think about the difference between how you obtain these guys compared to how you obtain Blood Moon Ursaluna, which are quests from the same character. But for Blood Moon, you have to go along with Perrin, do a little photo-taking minigame, and then you get ambushed by a Blood Moon in a Titan Pokemon battle. That's exciting. I mean, that was cool. For Raging Bolt, you just go talk to her, and then you go find it. And that's it. It's like any other Pokemon in the overworld. It's just there. Like, congrats on finding this incredibly rare and powerful mythical beast. Here's a sport ball. And it's basically the same as the other 25 legendary Pokemon that Snackworth gives you access to. Like, you see what I'm saying? This is the new Pokemon formula. You have the main game, one DLC focused around a new legendary with a cool design and real backstory and interesting mechanics. And then a second DLC where you shove the other 50 legendary Pokemon into the game. Are we happy about that? Because I like the first part, but the second part is really not for me. And let me loop back on why this is bad for competitive play. Because I hear the opinion that legendaries are bad and people don't want to see them in competitive, and I do want to push back on that. I think legendaries like Ogrepon and Heatran and Tinglu and the Tapus are actually really good for the game. They do interesting things, they have interesting mechanics, and have toolkits with strengths and weaknesses. Sure, they're better than most Pokemon, but they don't directly outclass most Pokemon. And when you give Pokemon with unique weaknesses, like Tinglu, for example, you also enable other relatively bad Pokemon. For example, Orthworm only really saw play because Tinglu was really good. But when you make bland, uninspired legendaries like Iron Hands and Fluttermane that have crazy stat distributions and the perfect move pool, that is actively bad for the game. They don't take any skill or creativity to figure out how to use. They just have the most stats, so you put them on the team. And because these Pokemon are so bland and uninspired, it makes it easy to overlook the fact that basically every non-legendary Pokemon in this generation have awesome designs. It feels like every single one of them is lovingly crafted and could be someone's favorite Pokemon. They also all have some competitive utility. Some of them can compete with these legendary Pokemon. So we see Pokemon like Dondozo, Armarouge, Maushold, Goldengo, Kingambit, Annihilate, Farigiraf, Archaludon, and Sinistcha all see play, like pretty consistently. And none of them see play just because they have a lot of stats, except for maybe King Gambit. They all do like unique things and have signature moves and unique abilities, and they have interesting combinations of tools that you have to actually build around. And there are also a whole lot more Pokemon that saw play exclusively in formats where we couldn't use legendary Pokemon. For example, Pawmot was one of my favorite Pokemon from this generation. I loved using it in my in-game playthrough, and it saw play in both Regulation A and H. It doesn't have great stats, but it has a decent speed, it has unique typings, 3 good abilities, and a great move pool, not to mention a strong signature move. But, of course, you would never, ever use it in a format where Iron Hands exists. Espathra is another example. It's one of the few Pokemon that has Speed Boost, which has some really cool applications, but Speed Boost does take a turn on the field to take effect, and I would never do that in a format with Urshifu in it that can hit through Protect, and Fluttermane and other Paradox Pokemon that just get the Speed Boost without waiting a turn. Even the bad Pokemon in this generation have interesting design that make you think about how to use them in competitive. Like, I remember the days where Poochyena was the early route dog, and that Pokemon is unredeemable. It's just a dog. Compare that to Fido, which has so much life to it. No one's favorite Pokemon is Mightyena, but Darkspawn? That's definitely someone's favorite. And well-baked body means you could experiment with it in competitive. You put it next to a Lava Plume, Hisui, and Typhlosion, and it was genuinely worth testing. It wasn't good, even by Regulation H standards, but I love that even bad Pokemon have designs that make you think about how to use them. Grafaiai is another bad Pokemon that has cool competitive applications. Prankster is a really good ability, and Doodle is a unique signature move that copies your opponent's abilities. Of course, this fails on Photosynthesis and Quark Drive, so you can't use it against the best Pokemon in the format, so why bother? Or how about Scovillain, which, with the introduction of Clear Amulet and Mirror Herb, has different ways to boost its partner's damage with Spicy Extract. It never quite saw the right combination of Pokemon next to it that existed in the metagame to make it good, but you can see the potential in its design at least. You had to build around it, you had to do interesting things with it, and it wasn't quite good enough, but that's okay. It made you think. These are people's favorite Pokemon, not Iron Hands and Fluttermane. But if you keep making 20 bland, uninspired legendary Pokemon and put them in your competitive formats, people are going to use them. And they're not going to experiment with all of these interesting strategies that are right under the surface, which, let's be real, is what the viewers want to see. And as someone who has cut multiple regionals and made worlds multiple times, these are also the strategies that I want to build around because every team feels different. And the metagame where you stuff all of your stat balls onto one team doesn't scratch that itch at all for me. Not to mention, it makes it harder to get people into competitive Pokemon because 1, people are less interested in watching that, and 2, legendary Pokemon are harder to obtain, so people have to put more time into getting their team. And again, just to be clear, I do not dislike legendary Pokemon. Pokemon like Ogrepon and the Tapus make the game so much more fun. But when you drop 30 stat balls into the game that all have the exact same gimmick, the game gets worse for it. So, if it were up to me, I would cut every single legendary from a past generation for this next game. We don't need them. If you're not going to give them a storyline, just don't put them in the game. And maybe try to limit yourself to 10 really well-designed legendary Pokemon in the next generation. And if you do that, you give yourself so much more room to make an actually fun post-game experience and a more interesting competitive metagame. Oh, and also you should make Unseen Fist do 25% damage through Protect. I mean, that's not super relevant, but it's the obvious solution to a problem that we really didn't need to have. I also want to say that I understand that the video game is only one aspect of Pokemon's intellectual property. There's also Pokemon Go and the trading card game, and they interact differently with the number of new legendary Pokemon being released. Although I still think that a crazy broken belly bolts trading card would sell better than a crazy broken Iron Hands trading card with the exact same effect, but that's not really my expertise. Maybe someone else can opine that. And also, maybe they need to create 20 forgettable legendary Pokemon so that the anime can have a bunch of C plots to fill time or something. I don't watch the anime, so I don't really know. My point being is there are more dimensions to this decision than just the reasons that I described, but personally, I play the video game, and that's the part of the IP that I really care about, so that's what I'm going to rant about. Anyways, I know that was a lot of different topics, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on these things. What did you agree or disagree with? And if this video made you think about Pokemon in a different way, I'd love it if you left a like, because that's what this video was really meant to do. And also subscribe, because these videos take longer to make than my normal videos. And while I want to make more of them, I also do just respond to feedback. And the main feedback I get is that number going up. Also, thank you to all my channel members. Y'all are the best. I appreciate all of your support. Hit that join button if you want to become a channel member. And yeah, that's it. Until next time, I will see you all later.